You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Carrie Wong. I'm an assistant professor here at the IOE. In this season of Research for the Real World, we're covering children, families, and the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic was unprecedented, and no matter how many articles compare it to the Spanish flu, the collective challenges have made our world small again. However, when it comes to challenges, none has been more difficult now than how children and families have handled the pandemic. So in this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Alice Goizes and Dr. Jenny Shanfro. Dr. Alice Goizes is Associate Professor of Demography in the Center for Longitudinal Studies at the UCL Social Research Institute. Her research spans a range of areas across social demography and epidemiology. She has examined the association between advanced maternal age and child well-being, with a particular focus on whether and how this relationship varies across different groups of the population and time periods. More generally, Alice is interested in whether, and if so how, family processes are associated with children and adults' well-being. Her research has been published in prestigious journals such as The Lancet, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, Demography, and the International Journal of Epidemiology. In 2020, Alice was awarded the European Demographer Award. Also joining us is Dr. Jenny Shanfro, a research fellow in demography at the Center for Longitudinal Studies in the UCL Social Research Institute. Jenny's main areas of research interests include gender, family demography, and inequalities in paid and unpaid work over the life course. Jenny holds a PhD in gender studies from the London School of Economics and joined UCL in 2019. She is also the co-founder of FemQuant, which is a network of feminist quantitative social science researchers. Both Alice and Jenny are working on an ESRC-funded project called Only Children in the UK, a life course perspective, which focuses on the characteristics, circumstances, and outcomes of only children over the life course. This involves analyzing 4 of the UK birth cohorts housed at the Center for Longitudinal Studies here at the IOE. I'm very excited to be chatting with the both of you today. Hello, Alice and Jenny. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you very much for having us today.
Yes, hello. Very pleased to be here.
Great. So just so that the listeners get to know you guys a little bit more, how did you become involved in education? And can you tell us a little bit more about your experience at university?
Yes, so I did my bachelor and master in business and economics in Italy, where I grew up. And during my master program, I was very lucky to have had the opportunity to take demography course, which was very liberatory for me because I realized that I could combine my quantitative and statistical skills with studying subjects that I found very important and relevant and which I felt very passionate about, such as those related to family formation dynamics. And so I spent some time working as a research assistant at Bocconi University, and that was very formative and made me sort of understand and realize that I wanted to continue with a career in education and university. And so I came to London to do a PhD in demography and population studies at the LSE. And I became very interested in topics around maternal age and childbearing postponement and how family processes and things that happen within the family are associated with child well-being and child outcomes. And at the end of, 2018, I won 2 research grants, and one of them is the project that we are discussing today about only children. And so I started my position. So I took up a position at UCL where, I've been working since early 2019.
That's fantastic. And how about you, Jenny?
Yeah, so I guess I've taken a somewhat non-traditional journey to get here. So I was a social researcher outside of academia for many years and then decided to jump off that track and go back to uni and do a PhD, which I did at the LSE in gender studies, but really looking at sort of the topic of family demography. And when I finished my PhD, I was really pleased to get the opportunity to work on this project. Obviously, as a family demographer, I've got an interest in families with children and, sort of who has children and how many children do they have. But also in a context like the UK, which has quite a strong two-child norm, I think working on a project that's specifically looking at one-child families, characteristics of only children is really interesting. And being an only child myself, if we have some findings coming out of the project that can sort of myth busting or can challenge some of the stereotypes that aren't supported by data, then all the better.
That's great. Well, I'm glad both of you ended up staying in academia and joined UCL as well in the process. Now moving on to a little bit more about the project itself. So Alice, as the principal investigator of this large, ESRC funded project, can you give us a bit of a summary about what it is about and how did you get to this point as well?
So psychologists in the late 1800 and early 1900 portrayed very negative view around only children and went as far as arguing that being an only child is a disease in itself. And despite the fact that these arguments were based on rather questionable research methods and practices and on a very, very selected sample of only children who were attending clinical settings. And despite the fact that research since then has at least questioned these arguments, negative views around only children have persisted until today. And so the motivation for this project, overarching motivation of this project, is to expound our understanding on only children, taking a life course perspective, so looking at their life outcomes early in life, but also by following them throughout the life course. And I would say there are three main motivations behind this project. The first one is that findings on only children, in some areas at least, are mixed. So, for example, in the case of education and cognitive outcomes, in most studies, we see that only children tend to outperform their peers who grow up with siblings. But in other studies, we observe the opposite picture. So why this is the case, what could explain the inconsistencies that we find in the literature? And one of the contribution of this project is to place emphasis on the economic and social factors that are associated with having one child, which can vary from family to family, from country to country, and even, over time within the same context. And we think that these factors are likely to have, a strong influence on the outcomes of only children, yet so far they have received a lot less attention and focus than the only child status per se. And so this is something that we really sort of integrate and build upon in the project. We give focus and emphasis on the characteristics of the only child families. The second, if you want, motivation for the project is the fact that a lot of the existing research has focused on the childhood period. So the theories and the existing evidence have largely focused on the childhood period. But only children grow up, become adults, and then they age. And yet we have a lot less evidence on their life course outcomes later in life. And so the second motivation for this project is to provide more evidence on only children as they become older. And the third motivation is that we have very little evidence on whether, and if so, how the well-being of only children varies over time. And so in this study, we make use of data from 4 British cohort studies, which enable us to follow the lives of only children over time in Britain and to analyze their well-being and investigate whether, and if so, how it changes over time in the UK.
That's great. That's a great summary. Thanks for that. And I guess just digging a little deeper into the four, birth cohort studies or data sets that you guys are using, why is it that you guys are using these four? But also, how do you investigate across these data sets to then answer the questions that you have just raised?
So we use data from four birth cohort studies, which follow the lives of children that were born in Britain in 1946, in 1958, in 1970, and children who were born between 2000 and 2002. And the last three of these cohort studies are actually housed in the Center for Longitudinal Studies, where both Jenny and I work. And the 1946 cohort study will soon join the other three. They are incredibly rich sources of data because they provide us with a lot of information on cohort members starting from early life, around the time of birth. For example, they collect information on birth weight, which we know is a very important indicator of health at birth, as well as being associated with many important outcomes later in life, including education and cognition. And then the families of the cohort members are interviewed in various sweeps across time, and they're asked information about the family and the environment in which the children are growing up, the resources which are available in the family circumstances, for example, if the parents separate. And then as the cohort members grow up, they start being interviewed. And so we collect information on their education, their employment, their physical and their mental health over time as they grow older. And so they are incredibly rich sources of data, a unique source of data in the world, I would say, which provide us with the opportunity to explore secular trends in many aspects of life, including health and well-being. And in this particular project, we are using the cohort studies to look at the lives of only children, their characteristics and outcomes across the life course.
Yeah, it sounds like a real treasure trove with lots of strengths of using big data, it sounds like. And perhaps maybe can Jenny talk a little bit about how you actually do that? You must need some, fancy statistical skills to address and manipulate the data set.
Yeah, so one of the strengths of using these data sets is that we can actually identify, as Alicia says, we can identify individuals who are only children and those who have siblings using the childhood data, but we can then look at outcomes in adulthood, which a lot of surveys that specifically target adults wouldn't enable us to do. We could look at those outcomes, but we wouldn't be able to identify who are only children because surveys of adults tend not to ask about siblings from childhood. Another strength of the data sets, apart from comparing the cohorts to look at sort of secular trends, like Alicia said, is that we can follow people across the life course, which is what we did in one of our papers where we looked at body mass index, so BMI. This is something that has come up in other research as differing between only children and those with siblings, but that research had mainly focused on the childhood phase. And what we were able to do is then, because we had BMI measures at different ages across the cohorts, right up until I think 63 might be the last sweep we have available for the oldest cohort, we were able to look at how that relationship between only childness and BMI differs as individuals age.
That's really cool. Kind of having the same variables across time points can then help us understand stability of traits and also changes in cohorts and individuals. That's amazing. And so as part of this project, I'm sure you guys have many papers already out and many more to come, but I also understand there's a research kind of impact piece to it. I understand that you've partnered up with other organizations and formed an advisory group. Can you speak a little bit more about that impact piece of the project and how it was like engaging with other stakeholders outside of the university?
Yes, it's been great and really, really interesting and useful to have other organizations involved in the project. So we set up an advisory board, and we have met with the advisory board a few times. And in this advisory board, we're very lucky to have representatives from Age UK, the Children's Society, the National Children's Bureau, and NatSen. So organizations and charities who are interested in the well-being of children and people across the life course, and because they have been involved since the early stages of the project, they have really been involved in the co-production of knowledge and have provided very useful feedback and have raised issues that we have been able to sort of integrate whilst conducting the research from the very, very, very early stages of the project. Going forward, and now that we have sort of produced enough evidence that we feel that we can sort of start the dissemination of the project findings, we're hoping to disseminate the findings beyond the academic settings. We have, of course, presented the findings at many academic conferences despite the pandemic. We have been able to do that, but we're really hoping to reach the wider society, for example, by engaging in podcasts like the one that we are recording today, but also by writing blog posts. We are hoping to reach, for example, teachers' organizations. And we would really also like to reach the general society through the traditional media, but also through social media. We have found out that only children have National Day, the 12th of April. So we're planning to disseminate some of our findings on that day, most likely through social media. And we're also planning a large dissemination event in the summer where we will showcase findings from the project, but also hold roundtables and discussions. And we would welcome, obviously, members of the general society as well as representatives of charities and governmental and non-governmental organizations who might be interested in only children and their life course outcomes.
That's amazing. Sounds like you are both keeping yourselves very busy, both during the pandemic and here onwards as well. Lots of things to outreach events and to reach other people as well. And just on the point on the April the 12th that you mentioned, I think Children's Day in Asia is also quite big and around that time as well. So maybe it'll coincide with all of that as well. And I guess maybe, just thinking back a little bit on your key findings so far. I know lots of them, all the findings so far are based on UK samples. But how do these findings compare to findings from other countries? Do you maybe have some experience of working in other countries that might inform this question as well?
So insofar as the work that we have on cognitive outcomes, we find that on average and across all the cohorts analyzed, only children have better outcomes than children who grow up with siblings. But we observe that these differences are essentially inexistent when we compare only children to children who grow up with one sibling, so children in two children families, whereas we observe differences between only children and children who grow up with two or more siblings, so larger families. And this is consistent with most of the research that has been published on the topic so far, but we add to that evidence by showing that the only child advantaged tends to decline over time in the UK. And because we are using data that enables us to compare associations over time, we observe that children who are born in the recently born cohort, so those who are born around the year 2001, in that cohort, the only children have fewer advantages compared to children who are growing up with siblings compared to children who were born in the 40s or in the 50s. And so although there is continuity between our study and that of prior studies, what we're able to show is that this gradient, this difference that we observe over time is explained by the fact that the characteristics of only child families have changed over time. And that explains why we observe these differences. So when we look at the characteristics of only child families, we observe that on average, they tend to be relatively advantaged And in terms of socioeconomic status, they fall in between very small families, so families with 2 children, and very large families, for example, with 3 children. But they tend to be relatively advantaged, and that is something that we observe consistently over time. However, what we also observe is that over time, the only child category has become more associated with characteristics that are usually associated with disadvantage. For example, having experienced parental separation or being born to a single mother and being raised by a single mother. So our results show that there is increased heterogeneity within the only child category over time, and that explains why we observe these differences in the well-being of only children, over time in the UK. And so we are able to sort of expand on the current literature by showing the importance of accounting for selection, so the characteristics of only child families and how those may help us understand inconsistencies across studies and inconsistencies across the studies that are carried out in different contexts.
That's super interesting. And I guess that's, again, like a key feature of your study and advantage of using cohort studies from different generations, so to speak, and that you can see, which of those things or how life has improved and then also had an impact on the lives of only children. Super fascinating.
Yes. So if I can sort of add something to that point, I think, so one of the overarching contribution of this project is to sort of highlight the fact that it is problematic to view only children as a unique and homogeneous category. And we think that we should appreciate the fact that only children can have different characteristics across different families, across different contexts, across different time periods. And these characteristics are crucial in understanding their well-being and whether, and if so, how their outcomes differ from those of children who grow up with siblings. And so if we move away from this thinking of, only children as a unique category and appreciate the heterogeneity and the differences within this group, we think that we can contribute to break some of the stereotypes that are still present around only children.
Definitely. And I think all the only children listening to this episode right now will be thinking the same, that they don't want to be, identified in this way or have such label or negative connotations to being only children. So I guess the next question I have is more about, thinking forwards, thinking about the future. So in what ways, do you think maybe only children or even children with siblings, how have they been affected by the pandemic, as this whole, 18 months or more has been quite stressful for everyone, really, but in particular children as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, like you say, it's been an unprecedented time. And I think particularly in the first lockdown in the UK context, which was the sort of social restrictions were quite strict. And in terms of school closures, they lasted quite a long time. Some year groups didn't go to school between end of March and beginning of September. And even as we then moved into the second lockdown, where there were some sort of concessions made for some families. For example, if you were an only adult in a household with children, you could form a support bubble with another household. There weren't similar thinking or provisions made for families where there was a single child, right? And the sort of social interaction that they may need with their peer group. So I think that would be really interesting to look at in future research. We would need different data to the data we're using in this project, because all of the cohorts that we're looking at are already sufficiently grown up that they weren't affected by the school closures. The youngest cohort is sort of in their late teens and early 20s. But I think that's definitely would be interesting to look at.
That's amazing. And I think UCL and the IOE, we have a new cohort starting up, don't we, as well? And that might be probably a question that they might be asking as well. So I guess I'm coming to the kind of the end of my questions. But the last one kind of, as with most research, right? You start with one question and then it opens up a whole can of worms. So what are some perhaps new research questions and directions that you were hoping to take the research to?
So there are many, many different questions that we hope we will be able to address in the future. And one of them is, as Jenny just mentioned, looking at only children during the pandemic. Another research question that we are hoping to address in the future is to look at the partnership trajectories of only children. And by partnership trajectory, I mean whether only children are more or less likely to, for example, marry, cohabit, maintain a relationship compared to children who grew up with siblings. Are they more likely to, if they marry, to experience a separation or divorce? And if they do, when are they more likely to experience that? So one of the sort of theories that have been sort of applied to only children is the socialization theory, which argues that only children are likely to suffer from the fact that they don't grow up with siblings because they lack opportunities to develop skills which are useful in life, for example, for maintaining relationships. Because of the lack of siblings, they might not be able to learn how to negotiate, for example. And so far, there has been very little support, actually, for the socialization theory, but studies have mainly focused on the childhood period. And so what we would like to do is explore outcomes later in life and test some of the arguments of existing theories looking at other aspects of life, which so far have not been looked at as much as the childhood outcomes.
That's really super interesting. And so many more questions to explore. Alicia and Jenny, it has been a real pleasure talking to the both of you. I learned so much and have more questions than before as well. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having us. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kerry.
You can follow Alicia on Twitter at ALICE_Goisis, GOISIS, and Jenny at JENCHANF to learn more about their research. Some of what we covered today are also available in the episode notes. If you enjoyed this episode and want to find out more, we've been around the block and have more episodes for you to listen to whilst you walk around yours. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, and to find episodes from seasons 1 to 11 of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. I'm Carrie. See you next time. Research for the Real World is brought to you by the IOE Marketing and Communications team,
in association with IOE Research Development.
This podcast is presented by me, Dr. Carrie Wong,
and me, Dr. Sam Sims.
The theme music was created by Rob Cochran.
Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor.
Amy Leibowitz is the series producer.
And Jason Illigan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.